I got humiliated and shoved into the kitchen at my son's wedding, so I dialed one number for the perfect revenge. I never thought that a wedding of my own son would be the moment I stopped being mother and became, in their eyes, disposable. The champagne flute was still in my hand when his fiancée Sierra turned to the server and said, just loud enough for every table nearby to hear, "The help eats in the kitchen." She didn't even look at me, but her eyes flicked toward Ruth, my assistant for over 30 years, and then past her, straight through me, like I was the wallpaper. My breath caught, but my spine held. A few guests tittered, some winced, one woman glanced down at her plate, and Daniel, my son, the boy I carried through grief and colic and the 2008 market crash, just adjusted his cufflinks and kept chatting with Sierra's cousin about hedge funds. Ruth looked to me, stiff, her face unreadable. I gave her the smallest nod. It wasn't the first slight of the evening, the name card that read Helen Sinclair instead of Mother of the Groom, the absence of my favorite champagne replaced with Sierra's sustainable rosé, the fact that I'd been seated 2 rows back at the ceremony while her spin instructor made it into the front. But this was deliberate, and I was done. I set my glass down, untouched, on the table, reached into my clutch, and stepped behind the garden's trellis wall. A cool breeze stirred the lavender bushes nearby. I could still hear the string quartet playing some light jazz variation of Coldplay. I dialed Thomas. He answered on the second ring, ever punctual. "Cancel the $30 million contract my son was going to announce tonight," I said, calm as a surgeon. There was silence. Then, "Helen?" "You heard me," I said. "It was mine to give, and now it's mine to keep." Thomas didn't ask why. He never does that. That's why I trust him. Understood. I'll notify the board immediately. I hung up. The roses beside the trellis had begun to wilt from the early summer heat. I plucked one, the outer petals already soft and bruised. The bloom had been beautiful, perfect even, but its time was over. I returned to the table. Ruth had refilled her glass but not touched it. She rose slightly as I approached. "You're fine," I whispered, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They'll need your poise now more than ever." We both sat, and then the toast began. Daniel stood, tapping his glass, the crowd murmuring to attention. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," he said, his smile dazzling beneath the garden lights. "Especially my mother, Helen, who I—" watched him falter. My name landed like a dropped fork. He'd expected applause. He got silence. Even the quartet paused. I tilted my head slightly, just enough to catch his eye. His smile faltered. He looked down, cleared his throat, then continued. "Who, helped make today possible? Helped. Past tense. The boy who once cried into my blouse after losing a Little League game now looked through me like a mirror with no reflection." Sierra clutched his arm, beaming. Her dress shimmered in the light like she'd swallowed a chandelier. I sipped water. The toast continued. Jokes were made, glasses clinked, but the energy had shifted. Mrs. Langford, seated near the fountain, didn't bother to hide her smirk. She leaned toward a young man beside her, Sierra's godbrother, I think, and whispered something that made him glance at me. Good. Let them whisper. By the end of the toast, Daniel looked pale. Sierra looked confused, but smug, like a cat that's caught a bird but hasn't figured out it was mechanical. They didn't know yet, but they would. By dessert, guests were murmuring about the missing announcement, the big news Daniel had teased all week, the new Sinclair initiative, the future he thought was guaranteed. Well, the future shifts fast when you remove its funding. You want to know the funny part? That morning, before the snub, before the toast, before the betrayal, I'd spent an hour deciding whether to wear the locket Daniel made me from 3rd grade, a little silver heart dented at the edge with a photo of the two of us inside, him missing a front tooth, me holding him in front of the very same fountain where they said their vows. I ended up leaving it in the drawer, not because I'd stopped loving him, but because I was starting to suspect he'd stopped needing me. After I stepped away from the reception and took back my power, I found myself wondering. Not physically, I was still at the estate, but in my mind, drifting. I remembered how it all began. I was 27 when his father left, not died, no tragedy there, unless you count emotional cowardice a tragedy, which I do. I'd been working as an interior designer for a firm run by three men who never once asked me for input unless it was about fabric colors or whether to flirt with a client. When the divorce papers came, I had a 3-year-old and $8,000 in shared debt. So I built something. With a toddler on my hip, I drafted plans by hand and pitched clients at the kitchen table while he napped in the other room. I designed homes and restaurants and hospitals, created beauty from nothing but drywall and willpower. I grew Sinclair Design into a respected name long before it was ever the family business. Daniel grew up in the office, toddling between blueprints and bolt fabric swatches. He used to call my leather portfolio Mommy's secret suitcase. He used to call me Mom. The first time he said Helen in public was he was 24. We were at a fundraiser. A waiter asked if he wanted to introduce me during his speech, and he said, "Of course, Helen Sinclair, founder of Sinclair Design." I laughed at the time. It took me months to realize I wasn't in on the joke. Somewhere between his MBA and his jawline obsession, he'd rebranded me. I went from mother to marketing asset. My name gave weight to his credentials. My face reassured investors. But my voice, well, that started to get too sentimental or off-brand. I let it happen. That's the part I keep coming back to. I let it happen. Oh, I told myself I was being generous, that he deserved a chance to prove himself, that I was passing the torch. But that torch kept burning me year after year, like when I offered to mentor Sierra, and she smiled and said, "We've hired someone younger, more in line with the brand's aesthetic," as if my face, my hands, my history were somehow outdated. Like when I found out just 2 weeks ago that they'd hosted a legacy brunch for influencers at the estate and didn't even send me the invite. At first I thought it was forgetfulness, a mistake. Now I know better. The wedding made it all clear. This wasn't a slow erosion. This was excavation. A steady digging away of my role until all that remained was the part they needed. The money, the name, the reputation, the facade. The next morning, while Daniel and Sierra slept in the honeymoon suite, I had Thomas draft the paperwork. We removed Daniel from the operating trust, quietly, without ceremony. Just one clause removed, like snipping a thread. It was the first time in years I felt like myself. By noon the next day, the whispers had already started. I stood by the garden fountain with a flute of sparkling water, no champagne this time, and watched them ripple through the crowd. Tiny social tremors, so subtle most wouldn't notice, but I was raised on instinct. I built an empire on understanding tone. They'd overheard it. Sierra's comment, "The help eats in the kitchen." The older guests wore their discomfort plainly. Tight smiles, downward glances. But the younger ones, the social climbers, the boardroom gossip, the legacy wives in backless dresses, they smelled the blood in the water. Ruth approached me quietly, offering a plate of pastries as cover. "Mrs. Langford would like a word," she murmured, then disappeared back into the crowd like the seasoned shadow she is. Mrs. Lillian Langford. Now there's a woman who knows how to wear pearls and wield a knife in the same breath. She used to host luncheons with my late husband back when the neighborhood still had maids and manicured hedges, and people gave a damn about using real linen. She found me under the shade of the old magnolia tree. Her heels sank slightly into the grass as she leaned in, eyes twinkling beneath her broad hat. "I heard what the bride said," she began, no pretense. I said nothing. She sipped her lemonade. "They forget who built the house they're partying in." Still, I said nothing. But I met her daze. Lillian smirked. "Well, just don't forget who's still watching, dear, and who remembers where the empire came from." Then she turned, heels clicking, and left me standing there with the birds chirping like they didn't know any better. I took that moment for what it was, a reckoning, a quiet kind, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but changes futures. By late afternoon, I was back in the library, the only room in the estate untouched by florists and fabric runners, my sanctuary. I pulled the file from the drawer, the one Thomas had updated just last month. It held all the trust documents, the emergency clauses, the succession plans. Daniel's name was listed in 3 places. I removed it from one yesterday, but now I looked closer, there was one section I'd ignored for too long. Trustee privileges. Not ownership. Influence. Power. Decision-making rights over assets that weren't his to begin with but would have been in time. No more. I called Thomas. Addendum to the estate trust, I told him. Effective immediately. Strip Daniel of all discretionary power. I don't want him co-signing a caterer invoice, much less a development deal. Understood, he said without hesitation. And the reasoning? Betrayal, I said. In both tone and content. There was silence, then, I'll have it filed before midnight. I hung up, and for the first time since the ceremony, I let myself breathe. You know what? People forget that silence doesn't mean surrender. It means observation, calculation, and sometimes reclamation. The wedding wound down by dusk. The DJ transitioned from curated playlists to overplayed classics. Daniel made the rounds again, shaking hands like a politician, unaware of how many of those hands now pitied him more than praised him. Sierra was all cheek kisses and performative gratitude, thanking guests for their support of our union as if they were donors and this was a campaign. I caught her eye once. She looked radiant on the outside, but her eyes? They flickered. She knew. Not the details, not yet, but something had shifted, and she could feel it, like a stone in her shoe. Ruth passed me a final list of guests as we left, those who sent notes, those who asked after me, and those who noticeably didn't. I scanned it in the car on the way home. One line, handwritten, and her tidy print at the bottom read, Lillian Langford gifted a photo album of the original estate plans, said you might want them back. I smiled. They thought they were launching a new dynasty, but what they didn't realize was that the ground they were standing on, it still belonged to me. It was a simple request, really. I didn't make a scene. I didn't even raise my voice. That's the thing about women like me. We don't need volume. We have precision. Ruth, I said, slipping off my gloves as we approached the main house, go up to the bridal suite and collect what's mine. She didn't ask what. She never does. And I didn't tell her everything, just that a few personal items from the family vault had been loaned for Sierra's wedding. Look, on paper, it sounded charming. An heirloom ring, a pearl-studded hair comb, a touch of something old from the matriarch of Sinclair Design. A sweet gesture. But I hadn't loaned anything. They'd taken. 2 nights before the wedding, Sierra's assistant had contacted my estate manager directly, bypassing me entirely. Said Helen had already approved the heirloom collection, even gave them the security codes. Ruth had flagged it. I told her to let it happen. Why? Because sometimes you need to let people show you who they are when they think you won't say a word. So I waited, and sure enough, there she was that morning, Sierra, dripping in borrowed power. My grandmother's sapphire ring on her right hand, my mother's ivory comb holding her curls in place, smiling for the cameras like royalty. Funny, isn't it? She could have asked. 1 sentence, 1 ounce of respect. But she took because she assumed I wouldn't dare make a fuss. Well, I didn't. I made a phone call. And now Ruth stood in the bridal suite doorway, composed as ever, while Sierra clutched the ring like it was hers. I don't understand, Sierra said, her voice pitched just high enough to carry down the hall. Ruth didn't flinch. Miss Sinclair has requested the return of all heirloom items from her personal vault immediately. But I'm still wearing them. She laughed like this was some silly misunderstanding. We're not done with photos yet. Ruth simply opened a small velvet pouch. You could hear a pin drop. Even the stylus froze, curling irons half raised in the air. Sierra's expression flickered. This is ridiculous. Ruth didn't respond. Tell her I'll return everything after the honeymoon. Ruth said, cool as winter. Miss Sinclair was very clear. Today. There's nothing quite as satisfying as watching a woman who is used to controlling the room realize she doesn't own the keys. Sierra removed the ring slowly. She even tried to act gracious about it, like she was indulging a cranky elder. But her jaw clenched with each twist. She plucked the comb from her hair and handed both items to Ruth, like they were on fire. Ruth placed them gently in the pouch, gave a crisp nod, and left without another word. By the time we reached the car, she passed it to me. I opened the pouch, ran my thumb over the sapphire's cool face. It gleamed in the light like it had been holding its breath. That ring had survived 3 generations of Sinclair women, worn in boardrooms, battlefields, and birthing rooms. It wasn't some prop for an Instagram reel. I slid it onto my finger. My ring, my bloodline. Ruth watched me, her eyes soft but proud. I suppose she thought wearing it made her part of the story, I said. She forgot who wrote the story, Ruth replied. Back at the estate, the bridal party was already taking group photos. I saw Sierra smile, pose, tilt her head just so. No ring, no comb, nothing borrowed. But her last name. She didn't make a scene. That's what surprised me. But I suppose she thought it was over, that I had made my little power play, and would now fade back into my role. Decorative, detached, deferential. Bless her heart. The next day, I had the vault recatalogued. Everything logged, labeled, secured, access codes changed, inventory double-checked. Ruth handled it, of course. She even sealed the heirloom collection in acid-free boxes and placed them in the temperature-controlled archive, just until someone earns the right to wear them, she said. That night, I slipped the ring off and placed it in my bedside dish. It had done its job for now. You see, I wasn't just reclaiming jewelry. I was reclaiming lineage. And Sierra, she may have walked down the aisle with my son's name, but she'd never touch our legacy again. It started with a spreadsheet. Not a confrontation, not a scream, just a spreadsheet. Emailed from Sierra's wedding coordinator with the subject line, "Final confirmation of registry funds and gift transfers." 38 entries, 38 generous transactions. Everything from a $10,000 travel fund to a $7,500 designer furniture credit. All supposedly gifted by Helen Sinclair, mother of the groom. I read it twice. I hadn't authorized any of it. You see, they assumed the money would just flow like champagne. They assumed the Sinclair name was not only a source of pride, but a pipe they could tap creelly, quietly, automatically. What they forgot, I built my fortune on details, and I read every line. "Ruth," I said the moment she walked in, "how many of these transfers have been processed?" She leaned over my shoulder, scanned the document with the precision of a neurosurgeon. 3 so far, she said. The rest are pending. I nodded, picked up the phone, and called Thomas. I need a hold placed on all outgoing wedding-related transfers, I said. Immediate, citing clerical discrepancies. Thomas didn't ask a single question. It'll be done before sunset. I hung up and let the silence settle around me. A few hours later, the emails began. Sierra, of course, didn't write me directly. She had her assistant do it. Just a quick note to clarify some confusion regarding the registry contributions. We noticed some pending items have been delayed. Would you like to resend the account numbers? I didn't reply. Ruth drafted a single sentence in response. Pending review. Please stand by. We sent that. Nothing more. It wasn't long before the whispers started again, this time among the guests. At first it was subtle. During the post-wedding brunch, I overheard a former client murmuring to his wife, "Did you hear the travel fund bounced?" Another guest leaned in, barely hiding her grin. "I thought the Sinclairs were paying for everything. That's what she told us at the spa brunch." And just like that, the shine dulled. Sierra noticed first. Her smiles were tighter now, eyes darting between tables. Daniel stood beside her, laughing too loudly at nothing, pretending the tension didn't taste like vinegar. Ruth and I stood by the hydrangeas near the back wall. I didn't need to mingle. The room was already talking. Thomas texted mid-morning, all funds frozen, pending confirmation of authorization. Legally airtight. Good. That night, I reviewed the full gift registry line by line. It wasn't just generous, it was greedy. A commissioned oil portrait, a full-year subscription to a luxury flower service, custom monogrammed luggage for their world honeymoon, all in my name. And the final insult, a request for a private couples retreat in Lake Como. Price tag $18,200. It listed the donor as Ms. Helen Sinclair, mother of the groom and benefactor of family legacy. Benefactor of family legacy? That's what they'd reduced me to. Not a person, a funding source, a tagline. The next morning, I had the financial team send a revised message to each gift vendor. Our office regrets a clerical oversight in recent Sinclair event expenditures. All unauthorized gifts are to be voided. Future contributions shall be directed per updated estate guidelines. I could almost hear Sierra's shriek from across town. That same day, Mrs. Langford dropped by, said she just happened to be in the neighborhood, though her driver wore a tuxedo and her lipstick was suspiciously fresh for noon. She sipped my espresso and studied me with open admiration. "I see the empire is still well defended," she said, tapping her manicured nail against the china. "Rumor has it the registry has been adjusted." I smiled, just cleaning up the books. Mrs. Langford chuckled, her pearls catching the light. "You may have given them a wedding, but you've given them nothing they can cash." Later that afternoon, Daniel called. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't sound angry. He sounded scared. "Hey, Mom, there's been some confusion about the transfers. We thought everything was set up the way you wanted. Just call me when you can, okay?" I didn't. I sat on the balcony of my study, watched the sun dip below the hedge line, and thought about legacy. Not just what we leave behind, but what we withhold. They wanted the benefits of my name without the burden of my memory. Well, let them pay their own bills. I don't know when exactly Daniel and Sierra started calling me strategic, but somewhere along the way, love became a negotiation, and somewhere after that, I stopped giving without a ledger. So when I met Thomas at his office the following week, I didn't wear black. I wore navy. Power without mourning. He opened the conference room door himself, no assistant. That was his tell. He already knew what this was. "I want to amend the will," I said before I even sat down. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Daniel's already out of the trust control structure. You want him out of the will entirely?" "No," I said, unfolding my gloves slowly. "That would be obvious. I want him eclipsed." Thomas leaned back, fingers steepled. "I want most of the estate redirected," I continued, "to scholarship programs, housing grants, endowments for design students from underrepresented backgrounds. And the rest," I smiled, "Ruth." His lips twitched. "Well deserved. I'll keep a small living trust for Daniel and Sierra, just enough so no one starves, but plenty to make them think I'm still generous." Thomas nodded, already taking notes. We spent an hour adjusting the structure, pulling apart the bones of what once would have been their safety net, and weaving them into something new, something lasting. I didn't do it out of spite, not really. That's the misconception people have about women like me. They think our boundaries are revenge, that our clarity is cruelty. But this was protection from manipulation, from guilt, from the long reach of people who smile while sharpening the knife behind your back. Thomas pushed a folder across the table. I saw my own name typed on the front. Helen Sinclair, Revised Legacy Plan. I'd carried Daniel through law school, through his first failed startup, through the down payment on that over-decorated monstrosity they call a home. He once told me I smothered with structure. Well, now I'd structured him right out of influence. As we wrapped up, Thomas hesitated. "You should know," he said, lowering his voice. "I've been hearing rumors about Sierra." I blinked. "What kind of rumors?" He pulled out his phone and opened a message. "Whispers that she's potentially shopping around the idea of a pregnancy. Conveniently timed. No medical confirmation yet, of course." I stared at the screen. It wasn't shocking, it was textbook. Sierra didn't plan parties, she orchestrated moves. She once hosted a baby shower for a dog just to get press. A real pregnancy? That was leverage. Thomas cleared his throat. "I'm only telling you because she's been seen speaking with attorneys who specialize in guardianship clauses." "Guardianship?" I asked, the words sharp in my mouth. "She may be laying groundwork," he said carefully, "framing you as unpredictable, potentially unfit." I felt my heartbeat slow. Unfit? Like a woman with too many opinions, too much memory, too much power? Thomas added gently. "We've seen this tactic before, Helen. Wealthy matriarchs declared confused, convinced to sign things they don't fully grasp, moved out of their homes for their safety." I looked at him. Then I looked at the folder again. Then I reached for my phone. "Ruth," I said when she picked up, "set up a full archive audit. Digital, paper, verbal. Every conversation I've had with Daniel or Sierra in the last year that touched money, property, or estate access. I want it cataloged. Understood?" she said immediately. And moving forward, I added, "no private meetings without witness logs. No exceptions. Even Daniel, especially Daniel." We hung up. Thomas poured me tea, Earl Grey, like always, and we sat for a moment in the comfortable quiet of a long friendship. "You're not just planning," he said after a while. "You're defending a kingdom." "No," I said softly, watching the steam curl into the air. "I'm defending myself from a family who sees me as a throne they're waiting to sit on." He said nothing. He didn't have to. Later that night, I walked the halls of the estate and let my fingers trace the picture frames on the wall. My wedding photo. Daniel at 6, covered in frosting. My first office. The company ribbon cutting. My husband, Richard, holding a toddler Daniel on his shoulders. A whole life arranged like a museum exhibit. A legacy, yes, but no longer theirs to inherit. The farewell brunch was held beneath the pergola, where white hydrangeas bent under their own beauty, and the breeze smelled faintly of rosewater and rot. I wore cream linen, no jewelry, no armor, just poise. Let them underestimate that. Guests sipped mimosas and nibbled on smoked salmon blinis, laughing louder than necessary, the way people do when they sense tension but don't want to name it. Sierra floated between tables, all pastel silk and teeth. If I didn't know better, I might have thought she was glowing. But I do know better. That's the curse of living long. You can see when a woman is selling something, and honey, Sierra was on a marketing tour. Daniel stood by the champagne fountain, jaw tight, fake laughing with the hedge fund friend whose name I never bothered to remember. He didn't approach me, not once. I didn't mind. I was biding my time. Near the end of the brunch, the DJ cut the jazz and asked for everyone's attention. A mic was passed. Sierra gestured for Daniel to take it instead. I stood. There was a brief scramble. Someone dropped a fork. Daniel looked startled. Sierra's smile twitched just once. "I won't keep you long," I said, voice clear and warm as if nothing in the world was unraveling. "I just want to thank everyone who traveled here, who stood under the summer sun, and who toasted this new chapter in our family." There were nods, soft applause. "But I also want to say something about legacy." Now they leaned in. "Legacy isn't built on photographs," I said, turning slightly toward the framed montage on the easel. Engagement shoots, vacation candids, those god-awful filtered portraits that Sierra insisted made them look timeless. It isn't built on wealth or wedding registries or matching monograms. I paused. Legacy is built on love. Quiet, unflashy, inconvenient love. The kind that shows up after chemo. The kind that remembers your favorite pie. The kind that doesn't make you audition for it. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the cicadas paused, it seemed. I smiled then. Not sweetly. Fully. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who keeps your name safe in their mouth. I raised my glass to truth, and to whoever tells it when you're not in the room. There was a long beat before applause started. Mrs. Langford clapped first, then Ruth, then a few others followed, hesitant but loud enough. Daniel's face was frozen in that mask men wear when they're still trying to calculate if they've just been insulted. Sierra stood perfectly still, holding her mimosa like a weapon she forgot how to use. I set my glass down and I left. Not dramatically, just deliberately, like a woman who knows exactly where she's going and no longer asks permission to get there. Ruth caught up to me near the rose trellis. "Well," she said lightly, "that'll be in the society pages before dinner." I handed her my clutch. "Good. Let them print the truth for once." She glanced back. Daniel looked like a man trying to count sand. Sierra looked like someone trying to light a match in the wind. We didn't laugh because it wasn't funny. Not really. It was just honest. That evening, I found an envelope slipped under my study door. No handwriting, no postage. Inside was a single note card monogrammed, "You didn't have to humiliate us." No signature, but the font screamed Sierra. I burned it in the fireplace, and then I wrote a letter of my own to Thomas, detailing what had just happened, logging it, cataloging it, keeping the truth somewhere safe, because that's what legacy really is. Not just what you remember, but what you record. I wasn't looking to overhear anything. The walls just weren't as thick as they thought. It was after the guests had gone and the staff had begun clearing crystal flutes and gathering linen napkins folded into swans. I'd stepped into the east corridor to retrieve my wrap. My bones ache when the sun sets, no matter how warm the day's been. A lifetime in heels will do that to a woman. I paused at the second floor landing, just beyond the bridal suite. The door was cracked an inch. The voices inside sharp and familiar. "You said she'd be predictable," Sierra snapped. "You said she'd do her gracious matriarch routine and roll over like always." Daniel's voice came next, lower, but cold. "Well, she didn't, obviously, and now half our guest list thinks we can't afford our own honeymoon." A pause, then Sierra again, her tone quieter now, sharper. "How long do we have to keep pretending to tolerate her?" My stomach dropped, but I didn't move. Daniel sighed, just long enough for her to slip. "She's almost 75. All we need is one confused statement on record, one missed medication, something we can show a judge." The words hit like a second knife. Not a betrayal of affection this time, a betrayal of intention. "She's not going to hand us anything, Daniel," Sierra said. "You're gonna have to take it." "She trusts me," he muttered. "She always has." "Well," she said with a bitter laugh, "not anymore." There was a sound of glass being set down, then her voice again, lower, like poison in tea. "If we want control, we have to move before she rewrites everything." Too late. I had already rewritten it. I stood there, motionless, not breathing, until their voices faded and I heard the door close behind them. Then I turned, walked calmly back to my study, and retrieved the small voice recorder I kept for dictation. Ruth had tucked it into my clutch after the brunch, just in case. She always planned 2 steps ahead of even me. I didn't cry. I recorded my statement. Spoke slowly, clearly, the time, the location, the content of the conversation. I signed and dated it. Ruth witnessed it. Thomas received it in a sealed envelope within the hour. Evidence not to be used today, not tomorrow, but one day, if needed, it would be enough. I poured myself a glass of wine after Ruth left. Not my usual Pinot, something darker, a Merlot we'd opened once at Daniel's law school graduation. I remember he hated it back then. Too bitter, he'd said. Well, I'd acquired the taste. I sat in the high-back chair in my private sitting room, the one Richard had picked out in Florence, back when he still believed a chair could fix a back, and let the truth settle. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were planning how to push. That night, I didn't sleep. I listened to the silence between rooms, to the wind against the shutters, to the last words my son spoke without knowing I was listening. Just one confused statement on record. That's what I was to him now. A vulnerability to document, a liability to exploit. You don't come back from hearing that. You shift. I looked at the portrait above the fireplace, the one of Daniel at age 9 wearing his Little League uniform and smiling like the world was still pure. I whispered to it. I raised a boy who turned into this. Then I pulled out the envelope with the backup trust access codes and moved them. New bank, new structure, new contingencies. Ruth and Thomas both got copies, but not the family. Not anymore. The second knife didn't make me bleed. It made me see. The beautiful thing about society, darling, is that its loyalty is only skin deep. Peel back the champagne toasts and country club smiles, and what you get are whisper networks, well-dressed scavengers waiting to see which way the wind blows. So I gave them wind, not a gust, a breeze. Subtle, scented with old money and something vaguely acidic, like overripe fruit. It started with a luncheon Ruth arranged. Quiet, Curated, 6 women I'd known for decades, wives of architects, deans, gallery patrons, the kind who don't need to be told a storm is coming. They smell it in the linens. I didn't mention Daniel or Sierra. I didn't have to. I simply let a few truths slip like pearls off a broken strand. Oh, I've stepped back from the trust board. Legacy fatigue, I suppose. I've decided to fund women's initiatives directly, bypass the family bureaucracy. When you've given someone everything and they still treat you like a wallet with opinions, it's time to adjust the estate. Don't you agree? They nodded. They always nod when a woman with power finally sounds like she's reclaiming it. By the end of lunch, 2 of them had asked to meet Thomas. One slipped me a card for a women's foundation in D.C., and all 6 left knowing that Helen Sinclair was no longer letting her son represent the empire. The next day, I sent a vintage from the cellar to Mrs. Langford. A gift. A cue. The following week, she hosted her own brunch. No Sinclairs invited, but I heard my name was mentioned 9 times. You don't need to wage war to shift perception. You just need to remind people who they'll benefit more from siding with. Daniel called during that stretch. Twice. I didn't answer. Not because I was being cruel, because I was letting silence do its work. Silence makes people nervous. It makes them talk. And talk they did, one by one. I started hearing things. Ruth would come in with her clipboard and say, Mr. Channing mentioned that Sierra's foundation was denied matching funds. Seems they don't consider her a controlling party anymore. Or, the Paytons have moved their garden party to early spring, didn't want it too close to the Sinclairs fundraiser. These weren't accidents. These were recalculations, and Daniel noticed. At the quarterly board meeting, my first one skipped in 12 years, he brought it up on the record. I'm concerned about optics, he said, fiddling with his Mellon pen like it was a life raft. There's been confusion about leadership direction. Some of our donors are uncertain. Thomas, seated 2 chairs over, looked directly at him and said, That's the consequence of standing in someone's shadow. You never know what shape your own makes. Daniel didn't respond. I had a glass of wine that night, alone. Not to celebrate, though there was satisfaction, but because for the first time in months, I felt steady. Revenge wasn't the point anymore. Reclamation was. My identity had been buried beneath titles for too long. Mother, widow, founder, benefactor. Now I was Helen, and Helen didn't have to justify a damn thing. Ruth and I updated the internal Sinclair Design directory later that week. Daniel's title stayed the same, but mine, Founder Emerita, with no forwarding number. Let them send their questions into the void. They always thought the company was his. That's the joke, really. That Daniel, with his bespoke suits and artfully tousled hair, was the architect of Sinclair Design's success. But Daniel never built anything. He inherited scaffolding and called it vision. So I showed him what it felt like when the scaffolding slipped. It started with the ghost portfolio. That's what Thomas and I always called it. The quiet holdings. The investments I'd made over decades, many of them in Sinclair's name, others in blind trusts. Real estate, shell core, licensing rights, dormant patents. Not glamorous, not headline-worthy, but solid, profitable, and entirely controlled by me. Daniel had no idea. To him, they were just numbers on a balance sheet. Successes he paraded at board meetings without ever asking where they came from. So, one Tuesday morning, over coffee and lemon toast, I began divesting. Not everything at once, just enough to create a tremor. A boutique hotel group we'd quietly backed, sold. That licensing deal with the Scandinavian textiles firm, reassigned. The long-dormant brand rights for the Sinclair Legacy collection, once slated to be Sierra's pet project, purchased in full by a nonprofit I founded that very same day. By the end of the week, a third of Daniel's successes had evaporated into thin air, and no one could trace it back to me. because that's the thing about ghosts. They haunt best when unseen. Thomas called me that Friday, voice cool and unreadable. Your son requested a meeting with the board to address irregularities in the portfolio. Shall I schedule you in? No, I said. Let him explain the house of cards without me. Ruth and I sat in the garden that afternoon, sipping chilled tea. The camellias were blooming too early, always a sign of false spring. He called twice today, she said, glancing at her phone. Left a voicemail, wants to, quote, clear up any misunderstandings. I'm not confused, I replied. He is. That evening, the Sinclair board released a statement about ongoing internal restructuring. The press barely picked it up, but the circles that mattered, they noticed. Daniel's name stopped appearing on fundraising flyers. A partnership meeting he was slated to host at the Design Council canceled without public reason. The empire hadn't crumbled, but it had been trimmed, neatly, surgically, and Daniel was bleeding from places he couldn't see. I received a letter 2 days later, handwritten. That surprised me. Mother, I don't understand what you're doing. I've worked so hard to keep this family strong, to honor what you built. I know Sierra has made mistakes, but she's trying. We're trying. Why are you cutting us out of everything? Please, let's talk. D. I stared at the page. Worked hard. He'd walked into a structure built on my back and decided to redecorate. And now that the lights were flickering, he was asking why the foundation shook. Ruth found me with the letter in my lap and a distant look in my eyes. You all right? She asked. I nodded. I just keep thinking. I handed him everything, and he looked at it like it was a menu. She said nothing, just placed a cup of tea beside me. I should have made him earn it, I whispered, or at least understand it. She touched my shoulder gently. You're doing that now. I folded the letter, didn't reply. Instead, I called Thomas. I want to donate the licensing proceeds to women in transitional housing, I told him. Use the name. Let the Sinclair brand mean something again. He exhaled through a small, grateful laugh. That'll sting good. I slept soundly that night. Daniel never understood. Money can't buy foundation, and when your success is built on borrowed scaffolding, eventually the ghost comes calling. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, no seal, just a photograph. I knew it instantly. Daniel's graduation day. He was 23, face flushed from champagne and ego, standing beside me with an arm slung over my shoulder. I had on that navy suit with the pearl buttons, the one Richard used to call my armor. We were smiling, really smiling. Taped to the back was a note written in my own hand. The last time you looked at me with respect. Ruth asked if I wanted to deliver it in person. I said no. It needed to land where he felt the most secure. So we mailed it to his office 2 days later. He called 3 times. I didn't answer. Let silence do the talking. By the end of the week, he showed up at the estate, alone, no Sierra, no driver, no camera-ready smile, just Daniel in a wrinkled blazer with a face that looked older than his 39 years. I didn't invite him in. We sat out back under the fig tree like we used to when he was small and sunburned and full of questions. I got your note, he said finally, fiddling with the envelope like it might bite him. I nodded, and I deserved it. Silence again. He took a breath. You think I don't know I screwed up? That I let her talk down to you? That I stood there and didn't say a damn word? I hate that version of me, Mom. I didn't correct him, because he didn't hate that version. He hated that it had consequences. I just wanted to build something, to be someone. You were someone, I said quietly, long before the board seats and the designer shoes. You were mine. He swallowed. I know that now. That's the problem, I said. You know it now, after everything. He looked down at his hands. I miss you, he said. I looked out toward the garden where my camellias had begun to wilt in the sun. Missing someone doesn't mean you get them back, I said. He didn't argue, just nodded once. I didn't come to ask for anything, he said. Not money, not access. I just didn't want to be a ghost. And for a moment, I almost softened, but then I remembered the recording. His voice in that room, just one confused statement, on record. I remembered that he wasn't here because he woke up with a change of heart. He was here because the ground beneath him had crumbled. You know what hurts most? I asked. It's not the money, it's not the board votes or the estate documents or the damned heirloom ring. He looked at me. It's knowing I raised a son who stood beside a woman while she mocked me, who watched me be erased one public moment at a time and did nothing. His voice cracked. I didn't think you'd care that was the fatal wound. You thought I didn't feel? I thought you'd just keep being strong. Ah, there it was. I stood then, slowly, carefully, not out of anger, out of finality. I am strong, I said. That's why I'm not angry anymore. He blinked. I'm done, I said. That's not rage. That's peace. He stood too, like a man waking up late for a train he can't catch. I'm sorry, he said again. I nodded. And I believe that. Then I looked him in the eye and spoke the last truth he didn't expect. But sorry isn't a door. It's a mirror. I didn't host a press conference. I didn't call a board meeting. I didn't even tell the family. I just left, one Friday morning before the sun had risen. Ruth and I packed up my office, 42 years of design samples, awards, ledgers, and letters, neatly archived into boxes marked Legacy Private. The only thing I left behind was a brass nameplate on the door that read, Helen Sinclair, Founder, past tense. Ruth handed me the last envelope. Inside was the press release. Thomas had drafted it exactly as I wanted. After decades of leadership, Helen Sinclair formally steps down from her role in Sinclair Design. She will continue her work through the Sinclair Initiative, a philanthropic foundation supporting women in design education and entrepreneurship. No mention of Daniel, no mention of family, just me and the future I was choosing. The call came just past 9. Ruth and I were organizing the reading nook in my new cottage, a sun-warmed space by the lake where silence wasn't suspicious, and every creak came from the house settling, not people scheming. My cell rang. I didn't recognize the number. Ruth raised an eyebrow. Want me to screen it? I shook my head. I know who it is. And I was right. Hi, Mom. Daniel's voice was scratchy, tired. Can we talk? I waited. I know I've said it before, but I mean it this time. I'm sorry for everything. For Sierra, for not protecting you, for making you feel like you were just some piece of property we were waiting to inherit. I looked out the window. The lake was glassy and still, not a ripple. He kept talking. I panicked. Okay, the company was slipping and I didn't know what to do. I thought I had time. I thought you'd always be there to fix things. I didn't expect you to just leave. That was the problem. They never expect us to leave. I'd like to see you, he said softly, not to ask for anything, just to talk, just us. I said yes because I needed to see the shape of his face when he wasn't hiding behind Sierra's smile or the boardroom spotlight. We met at a park halfway between the cottage and what used to be our city. He looked older, thinner, the kind of thin that isn't about weight. It's about certainty leaking out of a man, the kind of thin that happens when the scaffolding finally falls. Thank you, he said, for agreeing to meet. I nodded, let the wind fill the space. I just want you to know I'm not expecting anything, he said. Not property, not title, not forgiveness. I tilted my head. Then what? I want to start over. I studied him. No, I said gently. You want to rewind. He blinked. What's the difference? Starting over means you walk forward and build something new. Rewinding means you want to erase the damage without living through the cleanup. He said nothing. You had so many chances to protect me, I continued, to say something. When Sierra belittled me, when she twisted our history into her narrative, when you stood silent when she mocked the hands that raised you. I didn't think it mattered that much, he murmured. There it was again, that fatal flaw. You thought legacy meant name, I said. But legacy is memory, and you let her rewrite mine. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue. I found this in a drawer, he said. From when I was little. I thought you should have it. I unwrapped it. It was a drawing. Crayon and stickers on cardstock. A messy sketch of me in an apron holding a tray of cookies. It said, "My mommy is a boss." The O in boss was a heart. For a moment, I felt something pierce through. Then I folded it carefully and handed it back. I remember her, I said. But she doesn't live in the same house as the woman you treated like an ATM. He swallowed hard. So, this is it? He asked. There's no coming back. I gave a soft smile. Not cruel, not cold, just clear. I raised a monogram. I raised a son, I said. You raised an ambition. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and then nodded. We didn't hug, we didn't cry, we didn't reattach what had been cleanly cut. We just stood, the wind gently carrying away the last words we'd ever exchange as mother and child. It dropped on a Tuesday morning. No leaks, no teasers, just one crisp press release sent to every major outlet from the Sinclair Initiative's official letterhead. Subject, final statement from Helen Sinclair on the future of Sinclair Holdings. I sat on my porch with my tea and watched the lake mist rise like breath from the water. Ruth was inside on the phone with Thomas, coordinating, but I didn't need to be in the room anymore. The words were already out there. After 4 decades building a family business, I've chosen to divest completely from Sinclair Holdings. I have no further financial, legal, or advisory ties to the company. This decision was not made in haste, but in clarity. I am redirecting the $30 million previously earmarked for expansion into the Sinclair Initiative, supporting education programs and entrepreneurship opportunities for women of color. Legacy is not an empire. It's not a last name. It's who keeps your name safe in their mouth when you're not in the room. Helen Sinclair. That last line, that was for Sierra. I didn't mention her name, I never would, but she was the one who turned my identity into a monogram and my love into a ledger. Let her feel the weight of what she dismissed. It took only an hour for the calls to start. Ruth filtered them. The headlines poured in like tidewater. Matriarch withdraws from Sinclair Empire, redirects millions to marginalize women. Helen Sinclair retires with grace and teeth. Sierra Sinclair absent from statement, sparking rumors. I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't need to. I'd said what I came to say. Around midday, Mrs. Langford pulled up to the cottage. She wore enormous sunglasses and brought lemon bars in a tin older than some of our regrets. "You've done it," she said, folding herself into my porch chair. "You dropped the match without so much as flinching." I smiled. Matches don't scare me. I've been through the fire already. She poured herself tea, always bitter, like her opinions. "Daniel called me," she said after a while. "Oh," said. "He's taking time away. Sierra left last week." I didn't react, not outwardly, but something settled in my chest like a final page being turned. "Left?" I asked. "Filed for her separation." Her lawyers floating phrases like emotional deception and, quote, inheritance misrepresentation. She sipped. "Which is rich, considering empty pockets make for honest lawyers," I said. She laughed, full and wheezy. "You always had the sharpest spoon in the drawer." I looked at the water. The wind had picked up, pushing little ripples across the surface like whispers. "Did you ever love him less for all this?" she asked. I shook my head. No, I just stopped protecting his illusion. That afternoon, Ruth joined me for our usual walk along the shoreline. She asked what I wanted engraved on the foundation's cornerstone. I thought for a moment and said, "Tell the truth, even if it costs you everything." She wrote it down. We walked on. And that night, for the first time in years, I didn't dream about my son or the estate or the house that forgot to hold love. I dreamed of my own hands, stitching, building, signing, unmaking, and remaking myself quietly, fiercely, with dignity and tact. And when I woke up, I smiled, because I was finally alone and fully respected. The thing about peace is it doesn't come with applause. There are no congratulations, no awards, only silence and a kind of stillness you feel deep in your ribcage, like everything finally stopped rattling. I filled my days with things that mattered: walks with Ruth, slow breakfasts by the lake, stacks of books I'd put off reading for years. Sometimes I'd sketch. Not for clients, not for presentation, just to feel my hands do something beautiful again. Thomas visited once, brought his granddaughter with him. She was starting architecture school. We sat by the water while she asked questions, wide-eyed about structure, balance, and vision. And for the first time in years, I taught. Not led, not directed, taught, because I wanted to pass something on that wasn't attached to a board vote or a funding clause, just memory and method and care. Daniel didn't call again, not for months, and I didn't expect him to. Ruth handled all communication from the estate. Anything requiring attention came through her, though there was less and less to deal with each day as the trust quietly reshaped, and the weight of my name became less of a currency and more of a museum label. One afternoon in early spring, Ruth knocked gently on the door of the sunroom. I was journaling the way I did now often, just notes, thoughts, fragments I wanted to leave behind. She looked solemn, but not alarmed. "Thomas just called," she said. "They've moved forward on the legacy audit at Sinclair Holdings, and the final paperwork's been filed. Your detachment is now complete." I nodded, not surprised, but still a little winded, as if some string I hadn't noticed tugging at my middle had finally been snipped. "So that's it?" I said. She nodded. "It's done. And you, Helen, are free." I exhaled long and slow, and then without meaning to, I cried. Not loud, not sobbing, just tears. A quiet outpouring like rain on old stone. Ruth didn't speak. She just sat with me and waited until the storm passed. I poured us tea eventually, and we toasted. Not to endings, but to clarity, to boundaries, to finally letting the scaffolding fall away to see what stood on its own. Later that night, I lit the fireplace in the cottage, a rare indulgence now that I lived by a lake where the breeze was my central air. I sat in my chair, the same one Richard used to call my command post, and opened a folder of letters I'd kept. The ones that mattered. Thank yous from scholarship recipients, blueprints from young designers, old birthday cards from Daniel when he still signed them Love, not just his name. One particularly wrinkled note, written in crayon, caught my eye. It read, "My mommy makes the world pretty." The world wasn't always pretty, but I had made beauty where I could. And now I was watching it bloom without permission, without needing validation. The Sinclair Initiative had quietly grown in the months since I stepped down. New programs, mentorship circles, funding routes, all curated by women like Ruth. Sharp, capable, kind. The press had lost interest by then, moved on to newer names, shinier scandals. But I didn't mind. Obscurity was its own reward. One day, Ruth brought news of a young woman who'd won one of our first scholarships. Her name was Callie. She was from a town so small it didn't have a traffic light. Her application essay was about growing up in a house with peeling wallpaper and drawing on the walls to make them feel alive. She'd been accepted to a design program in New York and had sent Ruth a hand-drawn thank you card with a sketch of her mother in a room she had imagined for her, safe, soft, filled with light. Ruth handed it to me, and I cried again, this time not from sadness, but from recognition. Someone was building something not for profit or optics, but because she wanted her mother to have something beautiful to rest in. Callie never knew my name. Not really. Not beyond the line at the bottom of her award letter. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the lineage. Not of blood, but of care, of thought, of creation, of women making spaces safe and meaningful with their bare hands. A few days later, Ruth received an invitation. A panel on legacy and women-led business, hosted by an institute I'd once funded anonymously. They'd requested my presence, not as founder or speaker, just a guest. Ruth looked to me, curious. I smiled. Tell them I'll attend, but only if I'm listed under Helen. No titles, no last name, just Helen. Ruth smirked. Understood. We went together. I wore linen again, the kind that wrinkles with dignity. Ruth in her signature navy. She always said it brought out her seriousness. We sat in the back corner, near the windows where the light felt natural. The panel was fine, as panels go, but the Q&A was where it lived. A young woman raised her hand, voice firm. She asked, "What do we do when legacy forgets us, when it tries to bury us under branding and polish?" One of the panelists paused, thoughtful, then said, "We unearth ourselves, one truth at a time." I squeezed Ruth's hand, and for a moment, I felt a version of pride that had nothing to do with revenue charts or gala invitations, but with survival, with reclamation. On the way out, Ruth handed me a small notebook embossed with the initiative's new emblem, a rising vine. It felt right. Growth without permission, upward without apology. I took it home and placed it on my desk beside a photo of my mother in her sewing room, and one of me holding Daniel as a newborn, not for nostalgia, but for record keeping. Lineage isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it's a lattice, and sometimes it's a wall. But if you look close enough, you can always see the hands that built it, and mine were all over the foundation. The lake was still that morning, the kind of stillness that makes you think even time has paused. I stepped onto the porch with a cup of tea and felt the softness of it all. No headlines, no whispered betrayals, no contracts disguised as hugs, just air and memory and the slow understanding that peace isn't the absence of pain, but the choice not to carry it anymore. Ruth joined me with a small envelope tucked into her planner. "Someone left this at the initiatives office," she said. No return address, no stamp, just my name and handwriting I hadn't seen in years. I opened it slowly. Inside was a photo, a new one of Daniel holding a baby, small, bundled, wrapped in a quilt I'd stitched decades ago. His eyes were tired, but kind. On the back, in scribbled ink, was a single line, "Meet Ivy. She's ours." No demand, no manipulation, no expectation. Just a leaf from a branch I hadn't realized still grew. I sat with it in my lap, not rushing, not deciding. Ruth brought out the second rocking chair. We sat together, quiet, letting the spring sun soak our knees. I thought of all the women who came before me, my mother and her quiet strength, the clients who scoffed until I dazzled them, the assistants who trusted me, the staff who respected me, the friends who never needed to be asked twice. And I thought of Callie and her wallpaper drawings, of Sierra's betrayal, of Daniel's silence, of Ivy's tiny face in a quilt older than her parents. And then I did something I hadn't done since the wedding. I wrote Daniel a letter. Not long, just real. "Dear Daniel, thank you for the photo. She's beautiful. I hope she grows up knowing how much strength lives in softness, how much power there is in remembering where you came from. Love, Helen." Not mom, not mother, not even Margaret. Just Helen. I sealed it, handed it to Ruth, and said, "Send it when you feel the time is right." She nodded. She always does. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at an event honoring women in design, the kind of event I used to rush through, fitting it between meetings and dinner appointments. Now, I had time to sit in the front row and actually listen. Before taking the stage, they read a short biography, and I laughed softly as the moderator stumbled over the line, founder of Sinclair Design and the Sinclair Initiative, currently retired but never retiring. I walked to the podium, linen dress, sensible shoes, no armor needed, and looked out at the audience, mostly women, a few men, eyes wide with recognition or expectation or skepticism. I didn't prepare a speech. I just told them the truth about building something from scratch, about holding your baby in one arm and blueprints in the other, about the slow theft of legacy when you're not watching, and the louder reclamation when you finally are. I ended with this. We talk about legacy like it's a destination, a fixed marble monument we inherit or bequeath, but it's not. It's a path made from choices, from names remembered or erased, from truths kept or buried. Legacy is what you protect when no one's watching, and what you teach when they finally are. The applause was steady, not explosive, not performative, just honest, and that was enough. Later, Ruth and I walked through the garden outside the event center. Magnolias in bloom, petals thick and white and fragrant like memory. I paused by a small stone wall where someone had carved a line into the surface. Tell the truth even if it costs you everything. Ruth traced her fingers over it. You really meant it, didn't you? I always do. We stood there for a while, letting the sun turn our shadows into something longer, something lasting. That night, I dreamed of Ivy. Not clearly, just the shape of her, a laugh, a voice, the sense of someone being carried, not by me, not anymore, but by a world I had tried so fiercely to make better. And when I woke up, I didn't check the news. I didn't reach for the phone. I simply poured my tea and walked the perimeter of the garden, one stone at a time. Legacy was no longer mine to defend. It was mine to pass on, gently, fiercely, and with dignity, always. I reached the edge of the lake and looked out across the water. The mist was lifting, the surface calm. A single bird cut across the sky, wings wide, free. And I smiled, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't building anything. I was being. And that was enough.